Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We are excited to have this time this afternoon to talk with attorneys, pro bono attorneys, legal representatives about working with interpreters. Here at the National Immigrant Justice Center, we work with individuals from over 90 countries around the world. Our staff is about 140, and our pro bono network right now is just about 2,000 active attorneys and legal staff. So all of these people need to communicate. And we know that communicating about some of the issues at NIJC is also not always easy because of what our clients go through and the complexities of the immigration system. So we're excited today. My name is Ellen Miller. I am the pro bono manager. I use she, her pronouns. And we're going to have about 45 minutes of content today to talk with attorneys, legal representatives on working with interpreters. And who is here with us to do this? None other than Alejandra Oliva, who is our community engagement manager. She's also an author and fabulous interpreter herself, community-based interpreter. And so we're very excited to have her give us some tips and tricks for navigating and making these strong relationships. A few housekeeping issues to consider is this is a Zoom meeting, so please everybody control your own mute button. We generally ask that people remain off camera for the actual presentation just so that it's not so distracting. We will have time at the end for people to come on camera if you're available and to ask any questions or to share your experiences and kind of crowd, ask some other people in the room what they've done. We're happy to facilitate that conversation. The presentation itself, we will record and post on our website in the next couple days. We will not record the Q&A at the end so that everybody can feel free to ask whatever questions they need to ask. And I think there's nothing else for right now. So without that, I'm going to, without further ado, I'm going to share my screen so that we can get the presentation and turn it over to Alejandra.
Hello, everyone. I am so happy to be here and to have you all along for the ride for this training on how to work with interpreters. Sorry, exiting full screen. There we go. So NIJC is an organization that is dedicated to ensuring human rights protections and access to justice for all immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. We have offices in Chicago, Indiana, San Diego, and Washington, D.C. We provide legal direct services to and advocate for populations through policy reform, impact litigation, and public education. And translation and interpretation is part of all of those efforts. Since its founding 3 decades ago, NIJC has been unique in blending individual client advocacy with broad-based systemic change. Our meeting today is going to go over a couple key terms just so that we have shared vocabulary in common. We know what we're talking about. We're going to talk about NIJC's clients. We're going to go over a code of ethics that interpreters use. We are going to go over what happens during your meeting and what things to look out for, and then some do's and don'ts. And then we will wrap up with the Q&A. So defining key terms, these are kind of nice because they come in pairs, and so they are matched. So source, target language. Source language is the language you're translating from. Target language is the language you're translating into. Interpretation is the relaying of verbal or visual messages from a source language to a target language. So it's usually oral or visual if we're talking about things like ASL interpretation. Meanwhile, translation is transmitting things from a source to a target language in written form. And so you'll use people hear those two terms interchangeably. I probably do during this meeting, but if you're speaking with an interpreter or a translator, be very clear. Are we working with people? Are we working with documents? It's just one more thing to sort of iron out. Also, simultaneous interpretation and consecutive interpretation. Simultaneous interpretation is what you think of when you think of like a UN translator, somebody with a headset, saying things with very little lag at the same time as the speaker, just simultaneously interpreting what they're saying. Consecutive interpretation is probably what you're going to end up doing in meetings, which is the conversation has pauses in order to facilitate interpretation of what each person is saying a little bit after they say it. And then finally, the most important key term of all, language justice, on the next slide. This is an evolving framework based on the notion of respecting each individual's fundamental rights to be able to communicate, understand, and be understood in the language in which they prefer and feel most articulate and powerful. So in a system like the immigration system that is so dehumanizing and disempowering, being able to provide our clients the ability to express themselves as clearly and as naturally as possible, we're able to return that little bit of agency and power to them that the immigration system can take away, as well as strengthening our cases by ensuring that we understand each other as well as possible. Using an interpreter is one of the best ways that we can help reach that goal. By meeting our clients where they are linguistically, we give them the best possible chance to express themselves and their story. So let's talk about who these clients are. As the name might suggest, the vast majority of the people you will be working with as clients at NIJC are immigrants. In order to be an NIJC client, folks must also be at or below 200% of the federal poverty line. Many of them will have fled or still be actively involved in situations of trauma or high stress, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what that can look like for you, what that can look like for your interpreter. But it's also important to know so you can prepare in some specific ways. It's particularly important for someone who's coming in who has been traumatized, who's going to discuss that trauma, to establish trust with the client. We'll be going over several strategies to do that. And it's also important to know that emotional or physical reactions to difficult conversations or difficult subjects can look really different from what you might expect. And the key in all of these situations is to really maintain an air of non-judgment. For you who is not necessarily communicating directly verbally with the client, that also especially involves nonverbal cues. Accusatory tone of voice, eye rolling, crossed arms, anything that makes you look sort of closed off, judgmental. All those things are things we want to avoid. There may also be different comfort levels as far as literacy, tech literacy, and knowledge of professional norms. And it's important here not to just rely on your interpreter, but to proactively keep an eye out for things like a client wants something read aloud to them. They are not familiar with doing some tech stuff like sending an email with an attachment, scanning documents that we might consider part of everyday office work, but that they don't really have call to do in their day-to-day lives and may need a little bit more support around doing that. Especially for some of y'all who have offices in these big fancy buildings where you have the doorman and then you have your sort of individual office security. Really walking them through the different steps of what it's going to look like to come into your building can be really important, because otherwise you're talking to a lot of people in suits and not really knowing where you're going. It can make you feel really out of place and sort of anxious. And so making sure that they know the process, that they're registered in the system before they come, all these are important. And then if anyone needs extra support, setting up or logging into a virtual room of any kind. Our clients come to us with all kinds of cases and situations that you might be called on to help with, from children seeking special immigrant juvenile status if they've come to the US on their own or had an absent or abusive parent, to youngish people seeking DACA as part of our DACA clinics or naturalization, to asylum seekers and refugees seeking status or who have been granted status looking for help getting benefits. Survivors of crimes against them under the Violence Against Women Act or who are eligible for U visas, to LGBT immigrants. So these are all the different kinds of case strategies that we always have pro bonos helping out on. These are the different kinds of people who you might be in conversation with. And just as there are many different kinds of cases, there are also clients with very many different sort of language ranges or comfortability in English. So some clients may be really relatively comfortable in English, but still require legal interpretation because legal cases are really complex and they feel more comfortable in their other language. Other clients may speak nearly no English and need interpretation at every step of the way. And there are things kind of on either side of the spectrum to keep an eye on as the attorney. So for someone with more English, you will be able to do a ton of the logistical planning around your meetings. So setting up appointments, reminding folks of document lists, all of this sort of stuff that isn't super substantive discussion related to the case without an interpreter, which is nice. However, because immigration court really requires individuals to make a choice between having an interpreter or doing their case in English, it's really important that folks are used to working with interpreters and are used to giving time and space for interpretation to happen and not switching back and forth from one language to another. So during your sessions where you do have an interpreter, it's important that you're like, oh, hold on, wait for the interpreter to interpret this, or make sure you're getting the whole thing, and just kind of really work with them on practicing that, because it's a really different mode of communication than if you're just used to having a one-on-one conversation. That concern is obviously not that much of an issue for someone who has very little English. They won't really be tempted to be switching back and forth. But then what may be an issue is the logistical planning and having to rely on an interpreter or translator for support in setting up your meetings, or finding some workarounds to communicate with your client. This is especially important because we really ask that you don't leave the interpreter and client to communicate on their own in these instances. It really places an undue burden on the interpreter or can make them feel obligated to field legal questions and answer about advice in their case. And you want to make sure that you know what's going on between the interpreter and the client and sort of be part of those conversations as they're coming up. A quick note here on family and friend interpreters on the next slide. Your client may be used to bringing their own interpreter. This can be a child, a neighbor, a family friend. While this can be necessary and sometimes kind of nice for coordinating logistics, like see you on Tuesday or something, we really strongly discourage this practice, especially for substantive discussion. Although it can seem like the client will be more comfortable with an interpreter that they already know and trust, the result can actually be the opposite. Parents, for example, might not feel comfortable sharing parts of their story in front or sort of through their kids, and they may not feel comfortable talking about sensitive events with someone they see every day or know socially. Family and friend interpreters also may not have knowledge of special terms in immigration law and may not know or abide by the interpreter code of ethics, so that you can't really tell what's going on or how much is being interpreted. We've also run into the situation where if there's an existing relationship outside of the interpretation session, the client may instead begin going to the interpreter for advice or to clarify questions they have outside of your legal meetings. And you really want to encourage your clients to bring these questions to you instead of your interpreter. Additionally, sometimes the interpreter a client is able to find actually works as a notary in their community or is seen as someone who already has a great deal of immigration expertise and may or may not be charging your client for their interpretation services. Or just any number of other things that could really muddy your case and the things that you are trying to communicate to your client as their legal support. So it's really important for the attorney to keep an eye on this as you're working with the client, and kind of, if it is someone that they've brought in, to make sure that that's not a dynamic that's happening. But an easy way to control for this is to find your own interpreter. If you are working with NIJC and you are a small firm or a solo practitioner, or if you are working in a sort of rarer, more unusual language, we have language resource volunteer lists of people who have volunteered to be interpreters. You can come to us and ask for that information. But if you're at a large firm or a corporation, we do ask that you find your own interpreter. Places to find those are, we've seen a lot of our pro bono partners going to their own professional staff. So if you're going to professional staff, you need to be really, really clear about the work requirements as you set about, and be really clear and mindful of the power dynamics as you ask, not just sort of between attorney and interpreter, but between the two of you as colleagues and coworkers, and sort of where in the power hierarchy of your org the two of you fall. Work with them proactively to establish boundaries and make sure that you are conscious of what their schedule is, what their availability is, how much work they're ready or willing or able to do. And then be really mindful of the amount of labor and especially the pro bono hours you ask them to devote to a project. And we'll talk a little bit more about sort of the questions and conversations you should be having, especially with someone from your own org, but those are some things to keep in mind. You can also go to a translation agency, a community organization, or an interpreters collective. Your organization might already have a go-to translators agency that they use for doing business, and you can ask about that. If you're looking for a certain language, you can ask your city's local community organization if they have leads or know anyone who does translation of this particular language. And then there are also a few interpreters or language justice collectives in certain cities around the country. I don't think Chicago has one at the moment, but if you're located somewhere else, that might be something to look into. For any of these, however, you may have to pay your interpreter, as these are often not volunteers and the work that they're doing is really difficult and highly skilled. So it's something to think about. Next, let's go into the code of ethics for interpreters. So an interpreter should not add, subtract, or change anything about the conversation. A trained interpreter will translate things like side conversations, comments you make to yourself, etc. If the translator can hear or understand you, assume it will be translated. An interpreter should also represent their qualifications and any doubts they have accurately and timely. You may be working with either a trained interpreter or a volunteer interpreter who is just starting out. Keep this in mind as you work with them and manage your expectations and accommodations accordingly. Likewise, they may flag words or phrases that they're unsure about, and you can make this easier by trying to avoid using jargon or really technical, like legal language. Your client and interpreter may also come from different regions and not actually be able to understand each other, so be sure to check in at the very beginning of your meeting to make sure that there is clear communication between the two of them. An interpreter should be impartial and avoid conflict of interest or the appearance of it. This includes, again, words or facial expressions that can feel judgmental to a client. You should also refrain from asking your interpreter to pass judgment on the client in any way. So keeping side conversations to a minimum. Confidentiality, like you, the interpreter's meetings with clients are bound by confidentiality. They should not be sharing case details or identifying info with any outside parties. For interpreters that are working directly with NIJC staff, we do ask them to sign a confidentiality agreement. Your practices around that may vary, but it might be something to incorporate into your regular practice. That being said, we do have this saying, what's said here stays here, what we learn here leaves here. If you've been working with NIJC for a while, you may know that we often reach out to our pro bono community to ask for their involvement, their comments in policy campaigns that we're doing, or sort of getting comments together to oppose or support certain policies that are coming out. And we really want to encourage you to invite your interpreters to be part of those conversations and to be part of those comment campaigns. Just like you, there are ways for them to do that without really discussing the details of any individual case, but to really think about their relationships and what they've learned through interpreting. And we've gotten some really wonderful comments and participation from interpreters in that. And so we really want to encourage you guys to bring interpreters in on that. And then interpreters should stick to their role. When someone is an interpreter, that's their only job in that interaction. You shouldn't be asking them to weigh in. You shouldn't be asking them to take notes that will then be legible to you. They may take notes, but it should be for them. They're just there to interpret. That's their job in that interaction. Let's talk a little bit about what you can do to prepare with your interpreter before any given client meeting. You should be prepared to provide a brief rundown of the case if you have it. Things to focus on also that you can ask the interpreter is how to pronounce the client's name. Having that sort of knowledge and confidence in being able to walk in and talk to your client and pronounce their name right is really, really important in establishing trust, showing that you have made an effort to really meet this person where they're at, and is really nice. Knowing what forms you're going to be reviewing. If it's a blank form, you can send them that blank copy, either as a printout, or if you're going to be doing a telephonic session, doing links or attachments in an email. And if you're going to be doing a completed document or like a client affidavit, setting up a way to share a copy with your interpreter during the call is also really good practice. We have had attorneys recommend setting up a separate video call so that the attorney can screen share the completed affidavit, so that it is not living on the interpreter's computer, but they still are able to see it, sight translate from it during the meeting, which is a lot easier than interpreting. If you know that there are any difficult topics that may come up in the case that may be triggering to someone else, just sort of mentioning those so that the interpreter has time to prepare for that, knows what's coming up. That can be really, really helpful in making sure that your client or that your interpreter feels prepared and confident about the meeting. And if you have time, a bonus would be to have a list of vocab words in English that you think might come up with the client's case. So for example, for an asylum case, you might have English language vocab lists that include asylum, harm, persecution, police or government, credible fear interview. Having this particularly well in advance of your client meeting will allow the interpreter to sort of create a glossary for themselves, start learning that vocab, and just have a much smoother interpretation experience. That's particularly important for like new volunteer interpreters, I think. I would also really recommend, and this is again a nice to have and not a need to have, taking the time prior to meeting your client to look up a few sort of welcoming social words in your client's primary language. You will never hear me recommend Google Translate again, but it can be a good place to look up words like hello, welcome, thank you, things like that, that just show that you took a little extra time, made a little extra effort, and can go a long way in establishing a relationship with a client. At the beginning of the meeting, your interpreter should introduce themselves with a short blurb delivered in both languages. So we have a sample one, and let's go through it. So, hello, my name is Alejandro Oliva. That is the interpreter's name, especially if you're working with someone from an agency or who you're not familiar with. You should take note of their name. You'll be able to request them again for future sessions, or you'll be able to reach out if you don't already have a form of communication. This is also a good time to listen for name pronunciations and make sure you're getting your interpreter's name right, your client's name right, all of that. I am here I'll be interpreting for you in English and Spanish today. Languages, a check to make sure that the interpreter is in the right place. If the client actually feels more comfortable in a different language or didn't request a translator, this is a good time to check that. Organizational affiliation. I'm a volunteer interpreter with the National Immigrant Justice Center. It can be helpful to know what agency someone is working with or what qualifications they have. And with the client, it can help build trust, whether they're professional staff at your firm or an outside interpreter. It just shows that they are someone who is part of a greater institution or has some sort of accountability measure. During our conversation, please speak directly to the client or attorney. This is a really important step in building trust between you and the client, but also falls outside of conversational norms. So it's helpful for the client and you to be reminded of this prior to the beginning of the meeting. And what I mean by that is that you should never be asking the interpreter, like, hey, can you ask her if this, and instead of looking to your client and simply asking, what about this? I will interpret everything you say as you say it. This establishes what will or won't be translated as part of your conversation. It's helpful to me if you speak in short sentences and pause frequently so I can interpret accurately and carefully. I'll raise my hand as a signal if I need a pause. These are what I call the interpreter needs, and it can vary interpreter to interpreter. but it's important to make sure of that and to try and stick to that as you are in conversation with your client. Next, the interpreter should do a little confidentiality reminder. Everything I say and hear in this meeting will be kept confidential. This is really important to remind the client of this. If you are also working with a new interpreter and you don't hear them say this is a really good time to step in and say, as a reminder, this is a legal meeting. Everything in this meeting is held to a level of confidentiality. And then we're going to do a comprehension check. It's critical to make sure that the interpreter and the client attorney can understand each other. And especially in a situation that can feel kind of high stress for the client, like a legal meeting, I really like giving people the opportunity to confirm that they understand rather than assuming that they'll speak up if they don't. This is important in all cases, but something to especially keep an eye out for if you are working with someone who speaks primarily an African language, where dialects can really change a great deal depending on the different regions that someone is from, but they're still going to be grouped under the same sort of like language umbrella. And you also want to check with possibly Indigenous clients who may have listed their best language as Spanish kind of by default, because that's what most government forms give them the option to do, but may actually be comfortable in their own language. As the attorney, you may also want to confirm separately with the client that they feel comfortable with the translator using an alternate means of communication, whether that's a quick email or a note or something else, just to make sure that there's nothing that is popping up there. During the meetings, you may see the interpreter taking notes during your session. You want to, the interpreter should have cleared this with you and the client immediately before the session, just to give them a heads up. Interpreter notes should be destroyed immediately after the session. If you have a document shredder or a location, you can help by offering it to the interpreter. You are also welcome to keep the interpreter's notes in the same sort of confidential locations as any other client documents are kept, but a note that interpreter notes are often bilingual and kind of idiosyncratic, so there may not actually be very useful information on them for an outside party that's reading them. It's also really, really helpful to provide the interpreter with the forms you'll be reviewing. Again, if it's something that's already filled in, make a plan to share that in a way that the interpreter doesn't need to keep it or keep track of it. But it can really help to make sure that the interpreter sort of knows the structure of the conversation and is able to follow along on any documents that you're doing, just as kind of support. It's important to directly address your client during the meeting. You should maintain eye contact while they're speaking, look at them if you're asking them a question. So again, do you want a glass of water, as opposed to ask her if she wants a glass of water. The client and the interpreter will also be briefed on these same rules, but since they're so far outside of like our usual conversational norms, they may not stick to them, they might slip up. You might slip up. Be sure to remind yourself, remind the group periodically if you find yourself switching into sort of that second person question asking. This is really important in establishing that the conversation is between you and the client and not between the client and the interpreter, and can help build trust for later conversations where you're present, but perhaps the interpreter isn't, particularly USCIS interviews or days in court. Be sure to pause every few sentences during the meeting to make space for interpretation and to speak slowly and clearly as possible. It can also be helpful to indicate if what you say may take more than one sort of interpretation burst, so that the client doesn't break in or start answering a question that you haven't finished asking. So for example, as part of your application, we'll need to submit the 3 forms, and I'll explain what those are. Giving time for the interpreter to interpret, and then you start back in. Form 1 is this, so that you have prepared the way to show that you're going to speak more. Especially early on in any conversation or any given session, or if you're talking about something difficult or emotional, you may notice that there is not enough space being given at first because you're not really used to the new conversational rhythm of working with an interpreter, and later because when we're talking about emotional things, it's very easy to sort of like get carried away in the conversation. If the interpreter, you notice that they're falling behind, if they're having trouble, you can also pause and step in and say, oh, okay, we need to take a break for a minute for the interpreter to catch up. And you can do that either with a hand signal that's been established, or you can verbally ask to pause the conversation if you're doing it over the phone. Try to avoid side conversations whenever possible. And if you notice your client and the interpreter going back and forth, be sure to ask for interpretation. This is particularly important because if the client is asking questions or asking for clarification, if the interpreter is just trying to clarify or rephrase the question themselves, that may actually change the question. And it's especially important during preparations for a merit hearing, because if the wording of a question you ask is confusing for a client, you want to know which part was confusing so that you can ask it in a more understandable way then and in the future. You want to avoid jargon and specialized terms or technical language, which legal terms are really important because of their specificity, but they can also interject confusion, especially for someone who is a volunteer interpreter who's fairly new to this, and also for your client who may not know what these terms are or mean. So do your best to explain legal terms and concepts in simple language, and it'll make it easier for both of you. And then be aware of sensitive terms and topics. Just kind of be sure of what's going on and that you know what words could come up. And sorry, we can go back to trauma in the interpretation session. So as you're interpreting and as you're working with the interpreter, as you're having this meeting with your client, clients' stories can reflect our own, they can reflect the interpreters in the ways that are challenging and ways that can be triggering, and that regardless of who you are or what your history are, can just be really difficult to hear and respond to. We have other trainings dealing more specifically with trauma in the attorney-client relationship or as an immigration attorney, but I want to shift focus a little bit on what it means to work alongside another person, be in the same room as another person who might also be experiencing secondhand trauma. So you may notice that the interpreter or the client are really struggling with the subject matter or the interview. They're either very emotional or they have a very flat affect. They're fidgeting, they're having a hard time maintaining eye contact, just any of these things that we really associate with someone having a trauma response to what's going on in the room. I think something that you can do as the attorney in this situation is to offer breaks proactively and indicate really clearly the location of key resources like restrooms, water fountains, things like that. I think also coming into the meeting prepared with a few things to bring people back into their bodies can be really helpful. Doing breathing exercises with clients, having a bottle of water handy, tissues, chewing gum, a fidget toy, a stress ball to squeeze, things like that can really help people just sort of return to their bodies, feel a little more grounded in a situation that may make them feel a little out of control. This is also advice that I have been giving to translators, and it goes outside of the official sort of ethics or guides to proper interpretation. But as someone who's done interpretation herself, I found that responding to the client directly before you begin translating something that was really difficult or really hard to hear can be helpful. Saying something short and non-judgmental, like, thank you so much for sharing. I'm so sorry that happened to you. That sounds really hard. Not responding can make the interpreter feel like a robot and can make the client feel like their story hasn't really been heard. So for the interpreter and for the client, adding little like human moments like that can be really helpful. If you notice your interpreter doing that, or if there's little bits of conversation that you are not catching, like check in, but that's probably what's going on. After the meeting, as we mentioned before, you will likely know by the end of your first meeting whether you are able to communicate easily with your client for logistics purposes. Does Tuesday the 21st work, etc. If you think that won't be the case, save 5 minutes before the end of the meetings to schedule your next meeting while you have the interpreter present. Also make time to go over any forms or files or homework that you want to your client to do before your next meeting. If you're planning on doing this, be sure to check in with your interpreter before the meeting to see if they're up for another session, or discreetly ask before you start talking to the client about setting up another meeting between the three of you. Let's do some do's and don'ts for the session. Do listen to and respect the expectations and boundaries set by your interpreter. Just like you, they're often volunteers, balancing a full workload alongside pro bono work. Ask ahead of time around interest, availability, and whatever other things they're balancing, and have a conversation early on and then often in the interpreting relationship to ensure that you know what's on their plate and respect that as you continue working on their case. On the case together. So for example, I won't be able to translate that document over the weekend. I can only work during my normal work hours. I'd love to work with you on this case, but I want to give you a heads up that I have a report due on the 26th. So just like knowing what is coming up for your interpreter. And working around those things, because they're also working full-time jobs and doing other things just like you are. Also, don't ask your interpreter to give out their number or direct contact information to the client. Any communication that the client and interpreter have should also include you. This can look like group emails, a WhatsApp, pre-scheduled group calls that you are having. So you should feel free to ask for that information for yourself, but you really want to discourage your client going to the interpreter as the first point of contact in your relationship. Something else you may want to ask your interpreter before going into a meeting is if there are any common gestures, sounds, things like that that can be offensive in your client's language or culture. So thumbs up, okay signs, depending on where you are, those can be pretty offensive. So making sure that you know things that you should avoid is probably a good idea. Again, do stick to one language. Many clients who have lived in the US for several years are more comfortable in a mix of English and their native language, but at court and in USCIS interviews, they'll be forced to pick a single language and stick with it. So meetings with you are good practice for them to get comfortable speaking about their story in the language they will be speaking in sort of official meetings. Don't ask the interpreter to pass judgments or share opinions on the client. This is both important as a key to establishing trust with the client and as a way to hew close to ethical guidelines, both for yourself and for the interpreter. Sensitive terms. Be careful not to use offensive or stereotypical terms. For example, many languages normalize slurs against the LGBTQ community or minority groups. If you're uncertain, ask what terms the client uses. If you don't know if a conversation will involve a sensitive term, you may want to encourage an interpreter to look them up. In the interpreter training that we've developed to sort of match this one, we've asked that interpreters try to mirror the language that the client uses about themselves and to then replicate that in the target language. That can be challenging for any number of reasons, but it is something to sort of keep an eye out on as you're going through the meeting. All right. Thank you so much for coming. Oh, I forgot about Helen's quote. Helen is a former NIJC client. She came to us to get asylum, and she gave this really great quote about the importance of interpretation in her case. I know what my life has been. My story is true, and I can express it and retell it 1,000 times. But when it came time to fill out a form or navigate this new system, I wouldn't have been able to do it. These forms are also so hard because the words are so different from the way that people normally speak. And if you don't even know the language well, it's so much harder. So that shows you the importance of both working with an attorney and working with an interpreter can have on someone's case, and how important the work that you do is. So thank you so much.
Sorry, I was muted. Thanks, Alejandra. As always, you know, it's lovely to hear your perspective and your experience with these cases. We still do have some time, and we can turn off the recording in just a minute to take questions or to kind of share comments about experiences that you've had as legal representatives and attorneys working with interpreters, if you'd like to talk about that. But I think before we turn off the recording, Alejandra, I know that Sometimes it's also really important. We talked about power dynamics before. And sometimes setting up the room is a really important step as well. And I think when we're also talking about, attorneys and the interpreters and the number of the people in the room, I know that when we set up clinics, for example, at NIJC, we are very aware of sometimes pro bono attorneys want to have 2 or 3 attorneys there for different parts of the case or to hear the story for different reasons, plus the interpreter. And if everybody's sitting there and it's just the one client, it can be a little bit awkward. Would you have any other comments to talk about the space and power dynamics with this language justice?
Yeah, I think setting up the room in such a way that you can all really clearly see each other, but more importantly, that the client can see both you and the interpreter. Like if you have to decide between like 2 sides of a table, having you and the interpreter sitting side by side so the client can see you both clearly the whole time can be really helpful. I think also showing any forms and things that you're going to be working on can be helpful in just so that the client can kind of see what's going on and see what they're filling out and where their information is going. Anything you can do to sort of proactively explain our meeting today is for this, we're going to be going through X, Y, and Z, and that can be really helpful for both the interpreter and the client.
Great. One other point that I think might be helpful, and I know that we've talked about in other situations, is for longer term cases, what's your experience, coming in and out of cases at different points or being able to be on the case for longer periods of time? And are there any general recommendations, if an attorney is preparing for a longer term case, is it beneficial to have potentially 1 or 2 interpreters that might be able to stay on for the longevity of it? Or is it better to have people rotate in and out?
I think that having, again, these are really sensitive and important topics that are often really hard for people to talk about. And so being able to have a single person that sort of stays with the case throughout the lifetime of it, or a couple people, so that the client can start building trust, but also like, again, interpreters are people with their own schedules who can be really busy or who can be doing their own things. And so having a couple people maybe that you rely on can be helpful. That way, if someone ends up leaving the workplace or no longer has availability or any number of things, you have other people that you can kind of bring in. But ideally, and this is difficult, you are finding someone who is willing to work over a couple of different sessions at least, or a couple of different months if possible.
Great. And one other question, or maybe your experience. I think it's also important for attorneys to know when to intervene if you get that sense that something is going awry or something is not good. And this could be, in a USCIS interview and the interpreter is really difficult to understand, or there's a language discrepancy. I don't know if from your experience, you're able to share any recommendations or things to consider when an attorney should intervene to support the client and to make sure that the client is best represented.
I don't have too much experience around this specifically because I don't represent clients myself. But I do think that it is helpful for, again, even if you don't understand the language, it's really easy to see when someone is having a hard time emotionally, is panicking, is freaking out, is not understanding what's going on. And I think for those cases also are when you sort of need to pass like a confidential note or question to your client. This is another place where I'm maybe going to recommend Google Translate. So just being able to like have a quick like text through Google Translate conversation with a client being like, can you understand what's going on? Anything like that. And that's also probably what I would recommend if the translator that you've brought in is somebody who, for whatever reason, your client is not comfortable with. Just shooting them a quick note to be like, hey, is there something about this that I can make easier for you?
Are there any questions from participants today? Feel free to come off mute or drop it in the chat. While we're waiting for that, I will just make one more comment as somebody that has represented clients and is multilingual. I will also say that if, for example, you are in an interview where you somewhat understand the language, or perhaps you yourself are fluent as the representative, but there still is an interpreter there, and there is some misunderstanding, it is within your representation, to intervene, to take notes. I think depending on the agency, depending on the situation, there's different ways to do that, and you can talk to your NIJC point of contact about the best strategies to do that. But it is something, even if you are fluent or semi-fluent, or you're just a human and you know something's going wrong, to make sure that you do intervene, to make sure that the client has the best representation of their story and their case. That being said, if there's no other questions, or am I seeing a question here? I'm going to switch to the next slide here. And if you are here also for CLEs, I will say that there is a CLE evaluation, please. So you can take out your devices and there is a QR code. Otherwise, we will send the CLE link in a follow-up email. The CLE code word is justice, like National Immigrant Justice Center. So the CLE code word that you'll need to complete the evaluation is justice. Please make sure to fill that out within the next couple of days so that we can give you your CLE credit. And also, just for other housekeeping moments, we do currently have 86 cases in need of representation. If you are a pro bono attorney, you work with other pro bono attorneys, please share this information, and connecting clients with counsel and counsel with clients is what we need to do to make sure that our justice system stays just. If you know somebody that speaks another language and wants to volunteer with us, we do have a volunteer language support list, and it's available on our website, or that's the link there. So you're welcome to join us. We will be posting this training shortly on our website. And if there's nothing else, I will say, Alejandra, thank you so much for all your time and expertise. And thank you to each and every one of you for all that you do and the way in which you do it. We look forward to working with you. Have a great afternoon.